Thanks, Tom. Look, isn't it refreshing that we come here today to discuss the lofty battle of left versus right? Because, let's face it, as Walid alluded to, Australia is almost a post-ideological place. I say almost because we're actually more of a pre-ideological place. We just don't do grand ideas that much. And for proof of that, think of the dozens of people who'd planned to be here today who've been forced to miss the event because our Indigenous football code required not one but two grand finals, and I suspect Walid wishes he was amongst them. So given that irresistible temptation, I'm very grateful that you've all stuck around for the Ideas Fair. Is right the new left? In a word, no. No. While there are similarities in the intellectual journeys that both movements have travelled, and while the distinction between them has become blurred in parts, left and right retain fundamental differences, and I'm going to disagree a bit with Walid here. I'm talking about non-partisan left and right, and I think there are clear distinctions that remain and endure. But the question itself is a good one because of these similar journeys and because of these blurred distinctions. The right is now wrestling with the same existential questions that have gripped the left in times past. If right is not the new left, it's fair to say that the right is now travelling the same voyage of self-discovery, recently trodden by its philosophical opponents. Both belief systems have experienced profound intellectual failures in the past 30 years. In the 1970s, the welfare state championed by the left the limits of the welfare state championed by the left became painfully clear as growth stagnated and social unrest broke out throughout the developed world. In 2008, the right had its own collision with reality when our 25-year experiment with letter-rip free market capitalism ended in the biggest market failure that the world has ever seen. And both movements were left badly bruised by their brush with mortality. The reason that the right appears to be soul-searching now is that its failure is so much more fresh. For an extended period, the Reagan-Thatcher approach appeared to deliver on what it promised, that is, low inflation, high growth outcomes. But what that did is made the crash so much more stark when it came. A second reason why the right may seem like the new left is that the boundaries between the two have become blurred, as each side has kind of cloaked itself in positions more readily associated with the other, like some sort of bad retro fashion movement. And just consider some of these contrary positions. John Howard oversaw the biggest government in Australia's history with just lashings of middle-class welfare. Tony Blair's New Labor embraced choice and competition, two right-wing mantras in the public services. We've had Tony Abbott proposing government direct action on climate change and the mother of all parental leave schemes, hardly the stuff of small government. And meanwhile, the Rudd-Gillard government offers us an internet filtering scheme to make sure that we can't see all that dirty, smutty stuff on the internet. Again, hardly in the spirit of free-living, free-loving lefties. So the interesting question is, why has this happened? One reason is that the traditional support bases of left and right have splintered as the class structures have broken down. Where tradies were once of the left, they now vote Conservative, they're the Howard Battlers. Where inner-city professionals were reliably, dependably Liberal voters, they now vote Labor and increasingly Green. And not only have the traditional support bases broken down, but the old debates have broken down. And the protagonists are kind of struggling to define the contours of the future debates. For decades, the intellectual battleground consisted of a set of pretty well-worn, well-versed contests: the market versus the state, bosses versus workers, the economy versus the environment. These debates sustained the ideological warriors of left and right. But they've now been transcended, not because one side or the other won, but because economic and social change has made them redundant. The market and the state work best in tandem. Millions of workers are now their own bosses. Environmental adjustment provides economic opportunity. Just as an aside, one of the risks of moving on from these old debates is that we end up in the embrace of false debates. And let me give you an example. Population, a case in point. At the last election, both sides retreated from Australia's long-standing support of population growth through migration, supposedly because of impacts on infrastructure and, more importantly, on quality of life. This is an absolute nonsense. It's a farce. Quality of life has declined in Western Sydney because state government has failed to deliver infrastructure, not because of migrant numbers. And reducing migrant numbers will diminish our quality of life in the long term because the demographic bubble means that we won't be able to pay for an ageing population. So watch out for these false debates. They can do real damage. What we need instead is to debate the real challenges facing the country. How to manage the dividend of the mining boom. How to transition to a low-carbon economy. How to improve our education system so that it delivers the skills and the capabilities and the resilience that Australians are going to need in a 21st century dynamic, open society. These are the future battlegrounds of left and right. So this borrowing of ideas, this cross-dressing that we've seen from both sides, is really the product of three things. One, intellectual failures on each side, which have provoked great angst and uncertainty amongst the protagonists. Two, a fracturing of electoral support, which has led political leaders to chase new constituencies by borrowing ideas from the other side. And three, economic and social change, which has left old debates redundant and forced the contestants to search for new points of difference. These are the reasons why the right might seem like the new left. But as I said at the outset, the right is not the new left. Here's why. The right believes in, and will always believe in, the primacy of the individual. This is its defining idea. Individual freedom, in particular, is the cornerstone on which most right-wing arguments are based. Small government, free market, Hayek's magic catalaxy. Add to this a deep distrust of the collective. As Mrs. Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. Conversely, social justice and the power of society to deliver it is the defining idea of the left. The left believes that society is more powerful than the sum of its individual parts, that we create better lives by working together on common challenges and common endeavours. This building we're sitting in today, that bridge over there, these are testaments to this philosophy. So on both sides, these defining beliefs are powerful and they're enduring. Today and into the future, they'll define the contours of the debate and the positions on which each side settles. And these defining beliefs are the reason that for all the cross-stressing, right is not the new left. Now, this is a festival of dangerous ideas, so let me leave you with a dangerous idea of my own. An Australian Liberal Party. A Liberal Party for Australia. Not a Conservative party masquerading as a Liberal Party, but a real Liberal Party for people who believe in liberalism. That cornerstone belief of the right. A home for both Malcolms, for Peter Costello, potentially. A political standard bearer for Luke and his colleagues at the CIS. A counterweight to the populist conservatism of Tony Abbott. And perhaps even a credible exponent of intelligent centre-right thinking. Now, this would fill a gap in the Australian political spectrum. The left has responded to its internal divisions by spawning new parties from the social democratic parent, the DLP, and now the Greens, who are here to stay and are going to continue to challenge Labor. The only mainstream body without its own party, the only mainstream body of political opinion without its own party is liberalism, and a genuine Liberal Party would change that. Now, this idea is dangerous in both senses of the word. It's dangerous to the incumbent Conservative Party, who'd see their base fractured, and perhaps that's why I'm helpfully offering it up. As some would argue, it's dangerous to the stability of Australia's bipartisan system, but I just don't buy that. But where it would be wonderfully, mouth-wateringly dangerous would be in the battle between the leaders of the new Liberal Party on the one hand and the old Conservative Party, which calls itself Liberal, on the other. Just imagine Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull battling head-to-head for spiritual leadership of the right in Australia. Who could resist that? Thank you.
All right, well, we'll open it up to a Q&A. I believe that there are microphones sort of there, and if you have a question, please keep it short and a question as opposed to a comment, and address it to whomever you might wish to answer. Just by way of getting a bit of a discussion going, coming from New Zealand, where our labour market, while it is far more deregulated than Australia. I mean, when I first moved here, I was quite amazed with the kind of power and presence of unions in society here. Why do you think that? And it seemed to me that WorkChoices was neither especially radical nor necessarily a particularly unconservative thing to do, because although it overturned loosened labour market laws that have been in place in Australia for probably the best part of 100 years, it didn't do so in such a radical way that it really was going to completely undermine the union. I'm just interested in why you think that was such an unconservative thing, because I would say that John Howard would argue that, I mean, I don't know, but would argue that actually he was giving individuals a little bit more choice, and that was a good thing because primacy of the individual is at the centre of liberal philosophy, or conservative philosophy. And so...
No. There's a big difference. I disagree that the primacy of the individual is at the centre of conservative philosophy. I don't see any evidence for that, really. There's a concern for the individual. Edmund Burke was concerned for the individual. But the primacy of the individual, no, that's liberalism. And when John Stuart Mill was writing on liberty, his main opponents were conservatives. Famous letter he wrote to a Conservative MP where he said, I don't say that all Conservatives are stupid, but I do believe all stupid people are conservative. And no, the idea that the primacy of the individual is the preserve of conservatism or of the right, whatever that means.
Okay, so it was a liberal move from Howard. But
why
was it so radical? That's my question.
Okay, I think you said it yourself. It was an ideological position that he took. And it was radical because, as you said, it changed the capacity of unions that had been in place for 100 years. The Australian people certainly saw it as radical, which prompted the coalition at the last minute to try to introduce safety nets and things like that. It had radicalism written all over it. In fact, I would argue the reason that John Howard lost office in 2007, there were a range of reasons, WorkChoices was chief among them, was because the electorate responded conservatively. John Howard was making a progressive argument. He was saying we will deregulate the labour market as a further step to deregulating the economy, and this is going to be great because, yes, wages might come down and conditions might get worse, but unemployment will go down as well. That's the kind of big picture ideological thinking that conservatives, philosophically, are meant to shun. What did the electorate say? Well, the electorate said, I hear that you think it's going to be better for the economy and that overall there'll be less unemployment and so on, but I'd actually rather stick with what I know. It seems to be working okay for me. And your big argument about how we could make this better, I'm just not prepared to take that risk.
Okay,
that's the conservative response.
Okay, so and by implication, you're saying that the Australian electorate is actually quite conservative.
Well, in fact, this is a point that Mill was making as well. When you open up democracy to everybody, when you universalise the franchise, you get conservative politics. And the reason you get that is because the electorate, generally, as opposed to an elite, tend to be fearful of change. And that's a conservative temperament. Yeah. So, yes.
Okay, well, I know, Tom, you've got some views on this.
Just quickly, good point. Although I think it's certainly true Australians are, temperamentally speaking, quite conservative. There's no question about that. That seems quite clear. So much so that you even had a Labor Prime Minister at the recent election sort of talk Tony Abbott's language on various issues. Water protection, climate change, just a couple of examples. But how does this work for your thesis? I mean, during the 1980s, when the Hawke-Keating governments legislated radical free market reforms, tariff cuts, floating the dollar, exchange rate deregulation, all that sort of stuff, even labour market reforms, Keating made some changes on the industrial relations front. And these were seen quite rightly as radical changes because it tore asunder the Australian settlement that had been in place since 1901. And yet, Hawke and Keating kept being re-elected. There wasn't really a backlash from the community. Why is that? And why was it that case then and not in the case with John Howard and WorkChoices?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is, I think you're absolutely right to describe it as radical, what they did. And I guess I make the point that that's fine, they're not conservatives. They didn't plan to be. And they also did something that was, I think, ideologically consistent, which is what John Howard didn't do, and that is they understood that this is a radical change, we need to get radical, and that means transforming the social sphere as well. And there was the whole Asianisation debate, which then triggered Hansonism, and that's why a conservative would say, that's why you don't do this stuff. But Howard running into the radicalism of work choices, I mean, I say he was removed not just because of work choices, that was a major factor. But it had also been 11 years. A lot of his... I actually think that sometimes John Howard's political supremacy is overstated. He lost the popular vote in 98 and got in with less than 50% of the two-party preferred vote. In 2001, he had 9/11, which renders that election essentially anomalous right from the beginning. In 2004, he had Mark Latham. So... in each circumstance. And I think what's intriguing about the John Howard situation is actually when you look at the polling, people had been wanting to kick him out for a long time. They just couldn't find someone to vote for. And Beazley, because you had Labor polling well, but Beazley not, for instance. And so what happened, I think, was a confluence of factors. The discourse changed. Terrorism, multiculturalism, all those sort of debates that played very well for Howard where the times suited him, started to recede into history. And then Al Gore made a film and everyone started talking about climate change. Kevin Rudd appears. He looks a bit like John Howard. He sounds a bit like John Howard. He's a bit younger. And so the issues that defined that election were just not issues that played well for Howard. So I think in that context, work choices came along and it became radical because... Well, it was radical, but I think people responded to that radicalism. Meanwhile, Kevin Rudd's proposing that he's a safe pair of hands. At the same time as you had Hawke and Keating doing their radical thing, the Liberal Party, the coalition, weren't exactly in fine shape at that time, and were really struggling with their response to this radical new liberalisation of the economy. They were worried. There was that internal wet straws debate within the Liberal Party, for instance, that was ultimately won by Howard. But really wasn't settled till he won the election in 96. So the thing about politics is it's not just about whether or not the person, the Prime Minister is radical or conservative, it's also about whether or not there's an alternative that appears any safer. And I don't think the coalition was at that time.
One of the other differences with Hawke and Keating is that they took the time to build a consensus for these changes. And, you know, a lot of that was bipartisan. So Howard supported most of the economic liberalisation that Hawke and Keating pushed through and then finished off bits of it himself. And you could argue that with work choices, he wasn't able to secure the same level of bipartisan support. And, you know, it was all compressed in a much shorter time frame and the whole thing collapsed in the 2007 election.
I might just make the point that when New Zealand went through its liberalisation process, Rogernomics in the 1980s, because we had a first-past-the-post electoral system with no Senate, all of those changes could be pushed through incredibly quickly. I mean, there's sort of a blitzkrieg approach and, you know, people didn't sort of know what had happened. And in Australia, because of the Senate needing to actually get a bit of consensus, it meant that those policies that were put in actually have stood the test of time, which I think is quite interesting.
And I think, generally speaking, those reforms that were implemented both in New Zealand and Australia have actually paid wonderful dividends. I mean, Australia has weathered the financial crisis largely because of those economic reforms backed by both Labor and the coalition.
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, in New Zealand, a lot of the reforms were unwound by Helen Clark because the consensus wasn't gained, and a lot of, you know, and they really did. They were so quick they left an awful lot of society behind. I just want to pick up on your dangerous idea at the end there, David. Now, can you just outline to us an Australian Liberal Party who would vote for it, why they would vote for it, and if, as we seem to have a bit of a consensus, the electorate is conservative, what would be attractive, do you think, about a Liberal Party?
I think that there are scattered amongst the existing support bases sets of economically liberally minded and socially liberally minded people who don't get the kind of complete offering from any of the major parties. There are a lot of Greens voters who I'm sure are attracted by elements of social liberalism. Within the Liberal Party, the big L Liberal Party, there's this enduring tension. It's the Peter Costello, Tony Abbott debate that Tom was referring to. It's liberalism versus conservatism. So I think there is a strand of liberal opinion out there in Australia. I don't buy the argument that we are, by and large, conservative in the sense that we are wholly resistant to change, and I think that's kind of one of the themes that's emerging from the discussion. I think there is a recognition in the Australian community that the world is changing around us. So we're not in a position to.
What does that mean? The world is changing
what
around
sort
us?
of changes?
What does it mean?
The economic interdependence that we've all seen so frightfully exert itself during the global financial crisis is by and large a good thing. 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China because of a lot of the economic liberalisation reforms that have gone on around the world. Australia has been a very constructive participant in that process, I think. And I think the kind of example I gave a little earlier when we say, well, we don't want population growth anymore. We want to cut migration because commutes in Western Sydney and Western Melbourne are too long. I think that's regressive, and I think
It's pretty conservative, though.
it is pretty conservative, but I don't think the electorate buys it particularly. I think they know that a bad state government delivering bad infrastructure is
Just
underlying
to
all
disturb
that.
the harmony here, I mean, let's get a grip on reality. I mean, Middle Australia is so conservative that you've actually had a Labor Party, both in 2007 under Kevin Rudd and in 2010 under Julia Gillard, echoing the views, essentially, of Tony Abbott. I mean, both Labor leaders took off the ETS for a reason. It wasn't popular with Middle Australia. Border protection. She supported tough border protection because she knows where her bread is buttered. Not just in Western Sydney and the Sunbelt seats in Queensland. Australia is very conservative. This party you would recommend would get smashed just like the Democrats would. It would. It might go down well in certain parts of Sydney and Melbourne, but it would not appeal to the outskirts of Australia.
Australians are up for economic and social reform if the argument is made well and over an extended period of time. And I think what you saw through the 3 years of a Rudd government was that they rushed through a set of arguments without making the long case. And we're talking about Hawke and Keating. What they did is make the long-term case. And they bought support from all sides. And the electorate, supported them through 5 elections. So I don't think that without a strong case that Australia will always, sit on the conservative side. I think if there's political courage out there, if political leaders are willing to make the case for challenging reform, Howard did it through the GST, Hawke and Keating did it through a series of earlier reforms, then I think Australians are receptive to progressive change, but it's not a simple thing, and they expect the bar to be set pretty high and the case to be made strongly.
Let me take questions.
Yeah, any questions? Anyone?
I haven't heard a dangerous idea yet.
That's because we're too conservative.
We,
It's a shame, though, isn't it? It's a shame that we haven't identified something new here. We've just talked around that everything basically is getting a different name, perhaps, but nobody's actually...
Okay, well, here's an idea for you, mate. What about climate change? Why not just adapt to man-made global warming? There's a dangerous idea for you. Adapt. The costs of decarbonising the... What's dangerous about it?
to do that. How can we not adapt?
Well, this is the point I'm making. If all these attempts
You're absolutely right.
policy proposals to decarbonise the economy...
I don't think you understand what he's saying. Yeah.
But this is a dangerous idea. I mean, both major parties do support action on climate change, and whether it's through a pricing mechanism or not, they both are committed to reducing the emissions.
Yep,
the dangerous idea could be that if you decarbonise the economy, it might actually cause a lot more pain and very little environmental gain when other countries aren't doing the same thing.
Okay, one more question up the back here. Sorry, up by the microphone.
Is this working? What do true liberals have to say about the market when we know that we look at the world, that the market is presently being chugged along by China, communist regime and planned economy, increasing demand for resources and products from other societies like ours. What happens if you take out the Communist Party from China, and what do Liberals have to say about that?
Well, I'm not a true Liberal. My proposition was offered tongue-in-cheek. I think Luke's the right guy to answer this. He's the Centre for Independent Studies rep.
Well, that's a very good question. Well, so you're suggesting if the Communist Party collapses in China and they can't get the sort of growth they're continuing to get, I think is what you're asking. Look, I think China's growth has been prodded along by the fact that they do have an authoritarian regime, and if they were to democratise, I think that it probably would slow, and it has over the past couple of years anyway. But I don't think it'll be a sudden shock. So in answer to your question, I don't really think it would make, unless there was a sort of a revolution in China, which I think is unlikely, I don't think it would make much difference in the short term. Okay, well, we're just finishing up, so just some concluding comments from David Batt.
Well, I think there's a couple of strong themes that emerge. I agree with Waleed that progressive versus conservative is quite a useful delineation. I think it speaks to an openness or an attitude towards change or towards the status quo, depending on your position. I suppose where I take issue somewhat is the idea that conservatism can be the new progressivism simply by having a vision which it will either accept in its current form or strive towards. I think embedded in the notion of progressivism is progress. It's got to be a positive change rather than simply a vote for the status quo.
I think, just to reiterate, labels do, as I said before, they foster simplistic divisions and they do create these artificial alliances, and that's why it's virtually impossible to answer this question because they do overlap on so many issues. But I do think that in both Australia and in America, the centre of political gravity is to the right, and that explains why both major parties, particularly in Australia, have accommodated a swath of conservative segments of the community. And you saw that quite clearly in the last election when Julia Gillard went out of her way to oppose things like gay marriage, talked tough about border protection. She took off a carbon price off the agenda. Middle Australia is not really all that progressive. That's not to say that some progressive reforms are justified. In fact, I think some of the things we've talked about today, such as the economic reform agenda, was justified, but it has to be exceptional circumstances.
I want to be very brief because the ball's been bounced.
Football.
Yeah.
Victorians.
But come back to the point which was made. The argument that conservatives have become the new progressives is precisely about saying that progressivism is about moving us somewhere new. That's the point, whereas conservatism is about the preservation of the status quo or very moderated change, but as long as it's moderated. But let's not fall into the trap of thinking that progressivism is always about taking us somewhere better. Every progressive thinks they're taking us somewhere better. That's the point. And that's the conservative argument against it, is that we don't really want to be at risk of taking journeys with people who have a great idea, or what they think is a great idea, only to discover that it's actually hell on earth. And so I'm a stickler for terminology. I'm really worried about this. We've in the discussion, do we have a conservative electorate? And we're saying yes, because Labor adopted Tony Abbott's language. Well, I've argued that the Conservatives are becoming progressive. So Tony Abbott's language isn't conservative. That's part of my point. So we need to be really careful about this, because I think if we start to dilute terms like progressive so that, well, it's only when it has good change involved. Well, now we're at the point where there is no progressive. You're a progressive if you agree with me, and you're a fundamentalist if you disagree with me. And frankly, that's the way our conversation rolls at the moment, I think.
All I would add to that was that terminology inevitably changes over time and is invested in meaning as people give it. So I wouldn't be too much of a stickler about that.
Or we can have changed the meaning over time so it has no meaning, which is what we're doing.
So, yeah, a good note to end on. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And again, thank David Hetherington, Tom Switzer, and Waleed Ali. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Let's go. Come on.